at this point. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
I'm Stuart Price. I'm Professor of Media and Political Discourse at De Montfort University, which sounds like it's someplace in France, but it's in fact right in the East Midlands in the UK.
And de Montfort was a sort of, in inverted commas, heroic figure in English history, right?
Well, a kind of anti-hero in some ways because that was an email going off, by the way. So we're still busy. In terms of reputation, the elder de Montfort has got some major problems as a historical figure because he was supposedly involved in pogroms against Jewish communities. And many years ago, there was an intervention by staff and students to say, what's the issue here? Perhaps we should look at a name change.
Yeah.
And there was some discussion about this, but the initial response we got on from High was, don't worry. Sorry, sorry. This is genuinely live podcasting here because those are emails coming in. Don't worry about it because we named it after his son.
Of
So,
course we did.
of course, thank God for that. We haven't looked into the background of the son yet. We daren't do it.
Well, I mean, the other option is just to rename yourself Prince Andrew University, seems to
I
me.
think that would be reputationally, that would be a step above where we are at the moment. So that's good. And if any managers are listening, that was just purely for humor and wasn't serious.
Absolutely. Prof, I'm moving on from Andrew Windsor University. Tell me what's currently dynamizing, interesting, preoccupying, impeding you. What's going on?
I mean, in a way, if we kind of move from this brief discussion about the institution, I mean, I've been in this institution I'd like to talk about it a little bit first, just
Mm.
to
Mhm.
orient myself. I've been in this institution 26 years, and I've been teaching schools, universities, and colleges, 43, 44 years altogether.
Mhm.
But this place, in its initial configuration, was a great place to work. And I'm not trying to suggest that it would be otherwise. There have been issues, and we'll maybe loop back to that because there are major issues in UK higher education at the moment with regards to the size of the workforce and mass redundancies going on. But joining an institution like this, which was oriented to, people of color and working class people,
Mm.
which was the historic role of what is known in the UK, of course, as the post 92s.
Mhm.
They weren't universities originally, but a conservative government of all institutions decided to press ahead and organize the sector so that everyone was on equal footing. So we became a university in 92. So I joined in 99. So it, it was it was an amazing experience because at the time, when I joined, it was 2 years after the Tony Blair victory
Mm.
at the polls. And of course, despite other issues that we can probably cover in a way which have caused us to be in the nightmarish crisis we are in at the moment in terms of education, it was an expansion of the higher education
Yeah.
sector so that 50%, as you know, Toby, of the young UK population was expected to go to university. So those days were it's an amazing time, as Wordsworth once said. Oh, to in that dawn and what joy it was to
Mm.
be alive, or whatever. I can't remember now. And to be young, what very heaven. Well, we weren't young, but nonetheless, it was definitely a feeling of expansion, and media studies in particular expanded in that respect. So I know I'm being a bit historical here,
No, that's
but
great.
I got this job partly because I moved from London at the time because another institution was on the verge of collapse. But I got into that sector from being a school teacher and
Mm.
working in colleges because I wrote a set of textbooks which were the first kind of advanced level, early first year university textbooks.
Mhm.
And I mean, I didn't really know what I was doing when I was producing them because everything was so new. So media was an opportunity, and I started teaching it in schools in 1982 when it was not even an examined subject at that stage. It was just, I think it was you had things like the Welsh board started to create GCSEs and A levels and other boards, AEB, the rest of it. So when I started, it wasn't even an examinable subject. And we were at the bottom of the pecking order of the hierarchy, which went film studies. Oh, no, sorry, English literature, film studies, media.
Mm.
Media was partly because it was not part of our national curriculum in schools. It kind of set it free, and it was the place where a lot of very radical, free thinking, forward thinking, progressive work was going on, and that carried forward into the wave into universities, and that wave has subsided now, which brings us to your question. I've been very roundabout. Apologies. After this kind of brief historical overview,
Mm.
the thing that struck me most was the kind of decline in the sector and the kind of decline in certain assumptions about the public good, which, of course, the UK university system is meant to be composed of charitable organisations, even though not all of them are overseen by the Charities Commission. Nonetheless, they're not intended originally, at least rhetorically, to be institutions that are serving business interests. We
Mm.
all know this argument. There's so much literature about it. Now, this is not to look back with, um, what do they say, rose-tinted glasses at the
Mm.
past, because it was very patriarchal, it was very secretive, and it was an inimical environment to many of the groups that have since flourished in it. So that's the kind of setup I'm making, is that there
Yeah.
was this period of time when I mean, if you were a good lecturer and you could write decent stuff and so forth and so on, you were just like king of the walk. It was great. We all got a bit egotistical in those days, I think. If you were a good lecturer, you'd walk in, there'd be 200 people. They'd be sitting in the aisles. Your colleagues would turn up. So it's trying to, separate that
Mm.
personal experience from the trajectory we're in now, which is really severely on a downward trend transnationally, nationally, in the education system, in the National Health Service, in anything you can think of that was ostensibly meant to have a public orientation. That's the is To answer your question then, that's my it's the what do they call it these days? The perma crisis, which is not a perfect term, but it's it's as though, yes, we're back to basics, and you know, the people running the society, it's now much clearer who's doing it, I think, than 10, 20 years ago. The people running it, they've got a managerialist class in the public sector that will do anything to suppress dissent inside
Mm.
universities, which I don't think believe in freedom of speech anymore. So we've entered this kind of period, this cycle, if you like, where it looks like there's kind of no way out of it. We're in a period of decline in terms of rationality, cultural sensitivity, and the rest of it. And I can give examples. So it's that at the moment is the thing that I think is preoccupying a load of people.
Sure, and that's wonderfully put. Uh, Tying things back to where you began, talking about media studies being low in the hierarchy, but high in terms of intellectual and political endeavor, I wondered if I could ask you to meditate a bit on the field of media studies. This is something you wrote about very interestingly in a piece where you take on John Humphreys. Now, for younger listeners and those outside the UK, and that will mean the majority, thankfully they've never heard that bastard and ranting on and on and on about things. But he was the voice, not just of radio journalism in Britain, but in many ways, one of these men, and it was a male-dominated world in those days, who set the tone for news bulletins for 24 hours in the UK,
Yeah,
from every morning on the Today Show, a sort of a
yeah,
breakfast time news and current affairs program. So could you explain the sort of a critique of media studies that Humphreys made and your defense of it? Because presumably that's one of the things that has to go on now within universities, mount a defense of these domains.
yeah. I'm just to pick that last bit up first, and then go back to the Humphreys case and explain what that was about. It's not now just a question of defending the field that I accidentally took up when I got a job in schools, which is where it came from, but it's defending the humanities in general,
Mhm.
um, as we know, because Leicester University at the moment, which is the pre-92 university across the park, as it were, is undergoing mass redundancies in the very areas that would sustain intellectual life, if you like. I'm not saying anything negative about STEM subjects, about maths and engineering and the rest of it, but there does seem to be this feeling that we can now dispense with a critique of the system we're in. It seems now, if you're in the system, you shouldn't be critiquing it. Whereas previously, that was the whole point. And I'll come back
Mhm.
to an example of that later. But the
Mhm.
John Humphreys thing, the first thing was that this little piece I wrote for, I think I forget the title of it
A
now. The
conversation.
conversation, that's it. It's just a thing that for academics, and it was taken up and republished in the New European, as it used to be called, which was founded to counter the notion that Britain was better off outside the European Union, as you know, Brexit and the rest of it. But they carried that. They changed the headline in this little tiny piece I wrote because it was just I used to write opinion columns for the local newspaper um, when over a period of about 6 to 8 years. So it was kind of natural to make these short, you
Yes.
know, 500, 600 word arguments about something. But they changed the title and they made it a kind of personal attack on Humphreys, which I didn't approve of. And I'll tell you why in a minute, because it said John Humphrey, there has been John Humphreys. And I found that, oh God, no editorial control, of course.
Yeah.
But what he'd done was he'd described it in a sort he'd denigrated the field. Now, the issue is that the field is, as I said, about critique. And if you can't have, and I said this in the first textbook I ever wrote in 93, if you can't have a dedicated realm of discussion about one of the most important communicative not just devices, but communicative practices that's been known to humankind beyond speech and gesture and intonation. In other words, the Corner talks about this, the amplification of human discussion. If you can't do that without being criticized for the wrong reason, then there's something bad going on. And he wasn't the first to say it. I think I wrote a sentence and a half once in one textbook about soap opera, and one snotty review was, "Here's another book where media studies is talking about soap opera." It was like a sentence and a half in 300 pages. So
Wow.
there is that kind of very ignorant um, attack. But what's happened with media, particularly when in the UK we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, and I've got Unit of Assessment 34 to run for the university, which is media, library studies, communication. What's happened is that there's lots of people writing about politics who are entered into that unit because media studies is not a purist state. I mean, it started looking at text. There's a load of stuff about audience. I mean, you know as well as anyone in the world how it developed and how it expanded. So in the UK, you've got theorists and researchers, and they're basically interested in politics. Ostensibly, yes, the mediation of politics, but that's how so many of our entries are now so wide. That speaks for itself because I think media studies was an intervention that needed to happen. And maybe in that sense, the thing it's grown into now is not its original form, and it's more diverse, diffuse, probably stronger in that sense. But the original DNA has, I think, kind of weakened a bit. And
Mm.
maybe that's not such a bad thing. I mean, some of the people I admired most, I mean, John Corner writes so clearly and productively about media still. I was looking at a book of his the other day that some of the more complex European interventions don't match still. So that kind of UK empirical tradition is still, that kind of understated, slightly dry research is still there. Okay, now I've gone on too much. I think this is going. You're going to have to cut holes in this podcast, I think. But going back to Humphreys, um, the other thing was I was so upset about the title there, "The Has Been John Humphreys." Speaking as someone who's probably about to be a has been myself, please, folks, steady on. Mercy was the fact that at a certain point during the Iraq War, he was basically the voice of democracy. I kid you not on Radio 4 in the mornings. He was just the best interviewer and he
Was
tore
okay.
people apart. He tore people apart. He pulled government spokespeople on weapons of mass destruction. He pulled them apart like a warm chicken wing. It was amazing. It
Right.
was disappointing, of course, in his later manifestation. And if you've got time, I'll tell you one thing that he did that I blended into another piece, more of an academic piece later on, that showed, I think, the root of his the limits to his thinking,
Hmm.
because I think he's a clever guy. And that was when a Labour MP called Joe Cox was murdered in the street by some fascist.
Just
Um,
before the Brexit referendum, wasn't it?
Correct. And he actually shouted either eyewitnesses say Britain first or this is for Britain and stuff like this. Stabbed her, and he had some kind of sawn off a homemade gun, and he discharged it, and she died. So Humphreys was on the radio, and this is where Humphreys kind of accidentally trashed his own reputation because I wrote about this, I think it was 98 or something, a short piece for some journal, I forget. A good journal though, even though I forget it, it was very good.
Mhm.
So I was invited to write this piece, and I wrote it about Humphreys because the I think it was a police officer or someone involved in the case was talking about the fact that the assailant had been found guilty of terrorism, yes, had been called a terrorist, but clearly the guy was disturbed into the bargain.
Right.
What Humphreys did in his questioning was he reproduced an error that sometimes tiny kids make up to the age of 4, which is a category error. And he said, "Well, surely you know that this terrorism. The point is the guy was mentally ill, not a terrorist." And I'll tell you why I'm talking about categories in a minute. I'll come back to there's another case that is similar. So anyway, he goes on, and it caused outrage because the judge had passed sentence and it was regarded as a terrorist offence because of this political dimension. They found Nazi stuff around his house and the usual kind of stuff. But to me it was a fascinating error to make some apparently tiny little kids, for example, they can't understand why a daddy can be a doctor and a doctor a daddy. It's that kind of simple category error. And for a man at the time in his 60s, at least I should think, to make that error was odd, and it was very revealing about the fact that category errors are made all the time when it comes to terrorism. And that's why I'd like to talk about Jean Charles de Menezes if you've got time, as another category error. And I'll give the background to that as well. Shall I start? Shall I
Yes,
go ahead?
please
Yeah.
go right ahead
Right.
because this is a
Yeah.
very important case that I suspect is rather forgotten in Britain, but it isn't in Brazil.
No, in Brazil, it's absolutely. I've got a very close Brazilian colleague who's been working on this and organized a conference. I attended to talk about the media.
Great.
John Challis' cousins attended, one of his cousins attended, and
His
other
family
individuals.
has been
Yeah.
super involved ever since, right?
Yes, absolutely right. They wouldn't let it lie. But I'll give the background to that if I may. Would that be helpful for
Yeah,
people?
that's terrific, I think. Yeah.
2005, 20 years ago, um, I was listening to the radio, and this is not trying to be egotistical because more than one person can do this. But I come from a police family,
You,
and
okay, right.
yeah, this Metropolitan Police in the UK, that was my father was a Met police officer. As I was listening to this radio broadcast, it was during a failed terror attack in the UK. What had happened was in sequence, a couple of weeks before this, there had been an actual terror attack in the UK, which I think killed over 50 people. Four bombers had set off devices on the London Underground and in one case on a bus. So the whole country was in this state of tension. After this, I think it was about a week later, four bombers made another failed attempt
Yep.
that they didn't have the technical competence, and the police were hunting these people. And I'll come back to that probably later, as I keep threatening
Mhm.
to do. So then I heard on the radio that they had killed one of the terrorists, and just the way in which it had been announced coming from the background I had
Yep.
and witnessing, because my father was present during one or two, well, I won't go in detail, but one or two attacks in mainland Britain carried out by organizations that wanted the UK to leave Northern Ireland. Yes.
Mhm.
So, but I just heard this thing. I just sounded really strange. So
Mm.
I started recording and transcribing everything I could get my hands on because you know in terms of research if you don't do it right then stuff is going to disappear and you can't recall it. So the end result of this, and then I'll come back to the tale, was that I wrote a chapter in a book called Worst Case Scenario, which is about how supposed democracies use training regimes in a post-ideological environment in order to persuade people of certain things like the material nature of threats. So, for example, you would work backwards in the worst case scenario in a shopping center, which would be a bomb going off, and you'd train people in the shopping center how to evacuate, how to respond, and call the police and the rest of it. So my argument was actually this is dual purpose. If you've got attacks in shopping centers, you don't want people to be killed, of course, but equally the other point about doing that, this is the argument of the book, is to reinforce this post 9/11 internal security regime because it's very difficult to do that ideologically, especially these days, but you can do it by through training regimens or training regimes.
It's
So
something seemingly pragmatic and life-saving and
exactly,
non-ideological.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And you can see the pragmatic approach to training people to do other stuff, including training students to do endure block teaching in 7 week turnarounds with 30 credits. I mean, there are similar things going on.
Right. Yeah.
You treat the situation rhetorically, you come up with some bullshit
Yeah.
as a rationale, and then you train people to do stuff. So that's the background. But what happened was that, sure enough, in a couple of days, they had admitted that the police, presumably the police, certain sections of it, had killed an innocent individual called Charles de Menezes, who was a Brazilian electrician. And the actual event itself was horrific. He'd been followed on to Stockwell Tube, where we were recently, in fact, doing a bit of kind of groundwork before something else. And eyewitnesses said he'd run away from the police. A mistake. They'd seen the police running after him. He had stopped to take a newspaper. He hadn't jumped the barriers to get down there. The police had jumped the barriers, and the eyewitnesses got confused. But the police used some of this information and repeated it in order to give themselves some wriggle room, including the disgusting suggestion that Jean Chales, who was shot dead mistakenly in the belief that he was a terrorist, had been wanted for a rape and his visa was out of date. As those two things, even if they had been true, would have justified shooting someone. Of course, they weren't the case. It wasn't the case. But these kind of leaks show you that um, major institutions across the globe. Now we know what the Brazilian police are like, for example. My colleague has written extensive material on it and actually did um, research in the favelas because that's where she came from. But anyway, so getting back to the UK, the depths of moral and fiscal corruption inside the public sector,
Mm.
and now this thing is spread into universities. My argument recently, in the most recent thing I wrote, which is about managerialism in British universities, is that it is everywhere. And it is a solution to a crisis whereby working class people are permanently positioned in a place where they can receive, any shit that's going down. They are structurally positioned to take the fall all the time. And I'll come back. I keep saying I'll come back to stuff. It may never happen. But so, long story short, this event seemed to exemplify to me everything that was rotten. And I thought, as even as an act of kind of piety, almost to make as much as I could of this particular incident, because I saw the way in which it was treated in the press and elsewhere, and it wasn't the case. You the category error in Jean Charles' case was that he was constantly being moved as an icon, if you like, or as an exemplar in and out of the category of innocence and guilt. So, his visa was out of date for 2 years. He's guilty. The Home Secretary had to tell the Daily Mail, I think, at the time that that wasn't the case. Jack Straw, I think, was Home Secretary at the time in the Labour government. So it was horrific. But the other part of it that is interesting is the way in which it connected to other security events. In the UK, in Northern Ireland, there was something called the hard stop. The
Yep.
hard stop is where, as you probably know, it's usually about checkpoints. A car is accelerating through a checkpoint, and mysteriously, the soldiers who shoot the passengers and driver dead all have the identical story, which was that it sped up towards them and they feared for their own safety, etc. Now, I'm exaggerating for effect, but what's interesting was the same kind of stuff emerged during Jean Chalais, even a BBC documentary. It's interesting at the moment that I think it's Disney that is making quite a hard-hitting drama documentary, I think, about the whole case. But I think the BBC or Channel 4, I can't remember which, I think it was the BBC, made a documentary in which one police officer who'd been responsible for shooting this innocent guy dead, was finally revealed to the public and talked about his own PTSD and trauma. And 20 years ago, this is something I'd seen in the press and made a major critique of in what I was writing. You know, oh my God, the trauma is always about the person who has
Yep.
to pull the trigger. And most disgustingly, in The Guardian, the liberal left newspaper, the headline the next day was "Seconds to Decide If the Suspect Is," you know, and about kind of basically when do you pull the trigger? And it was trying to bring and draw in the British public to occupy the position of the assassin, if you want to call it that. Do you see what I mean? I mean, that was one of the shocking modes. It's like watching those Vietnam movies, no offense to people, but when they're purely only dealing with PTSD, and a number of people have written about this,
Sure.
I did, Two other colleagues, one who died recently, wrote about Vietnam movies, and the PTSD stops at the door of the veteran and the rest of it. So this was just an example of it. So I've gone on a bit and probably not returned to the beginning, but that event in 2005 was one of the things that I think was alarming to a lot of people in the analytical field, let's call it,
Hmm.
and amongst lawyers and amongst, public advocates of various type. It was, but I'm sure to some people in the security state, they say, oh, that is tragic, which is the term they would use. But nonetheless, well, that's a good dry run. Sorry to
Well,
be.
only this week we've seen a person unnamed found not guilty of murders,
Yeah,
assassinations, whatever we call them on Sunday, Bloody Sunday. Now,
yeah,
of course, I'm not in a position to make a judgment on the guilt or otherwise of the
exactly. Yeah.
man, but raison d'etat is again and again used to protect these people. And the
Mhm.
new element, as you say, is the humanization of them in terms of their own feelings.
I'm not denying those feelings don't take place.
No, 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 you're not. But the point is,
This guy,
this
this I tell you
PTSD
this guy
applies to
was.
everybody who
Yeah,
knew
yeah.
him and everybody who saw what happened. Who
Exactly,
knew about
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the police in the Jean Charles de case dragged the tube driver out of his cab. The guy was Afro-Caribbean and pointed guns at him. Such was the confusion at the time. But I don't deny the PTSD. I mean, the guy who was talking in this documentary made it clear that, the shot was, I think there was 7 shots. They shot this Brazilian guy 7 times. And he was covered in his brains afterwards, of course. But it's just putting these into the category of tragedy. Tragedy is when lightning strikes a pram, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Tragedy is not when you've had an intense plan. It's known in the UK as Operation Kratos, and there was a lot of talk about the officers had warned the victim. The eyewitnesses said no warning was issued because actually Operation Kratos, which is still apparently in force, doesn't require a warning from the officers concerned. And that apparently one of the officers involved in the Jean Charles case, I think a few months later, shot dead an armed robber who hadn't discharged his weapon but was threatening someone with it from a concealed position with no warning. So it's okay if you're going to extend empathy, sympathy to everyone involved in the current disaster that is the social order, then let's at least, what do we have to do? We have to, tell the truth about stuff. And the problem with this case is there's, people like my colleague are still trying to cut off massive falsehoods that were used at the time. I'll give you one. Like Jean Charles was wearing a bulky jacket with wires coming from it. The Daily Mail illustrated this with a kind of cartoon of someone getting apprehended with wires. There was no bulky jacket, there were no wires, but there's been no apology.
And we
So,
should say, by the way,
yeah.
that the journalists' salaries at the Daily Mail are, I think, still by far the highest in Britain of any
Wow, I
paper.
didn't know that. Yeah.
Oh,
I
yeah.
did meet one at the university, was become a lecturer, and he was going to come and do some stuff for me, but I think he got cold feet because he told me, "Yeah, well, I never believed what I was writing, but it's, an editorial line that you would adhere to." And I
Um,
know the way it's the other thing was, of course, the Corbyn event, and I was
yeah.
doing some lectures on how Corbyn was treated. I mean, it was beyond. I've still got all the press from that time, and just the stuff they made up about this guy to make sure that he didn't become prime minister was astonishing.
Well, they also, you'll remember when Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party, a much less troublesome figure for them, described his and David's father, Ralph Miliband, of course, a very distinguished and important
Yeah,
Marxist theorist and way to the left of his sons, as, hating Britain, when
yeah,
this was a guy who was a refugee to Britain,
yeah.
who dedicated his life to helping save it during the Second World Bloody War. You know,
Yes, yes. Well, the Miliband thing, he had that long debate with Poulantzas, didn't he?
that's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
You know,
I've
about
still got my, I mean, reading Poulantzas was where, one of the places I started out. But this is the thing. One of the questions, of course, is that we do get in the sector that is answered one way that I think is maybe slightly mistaken is about bias. Because clearly a lot of people in this field have come from backgrounds that one way or another have pushed them towards some form of moral critique of the system they're in.
Mhm.
Okay. You get the stuff like, oh, you're a lecturer, professor of you get the benefits, kind of stuff like this. It's like saying, you evil people are breathing our air. It's just, we can't help where we are, as it were, though we're conscious of the contradictions in our own position. Having said that, working in universities in the UK as professor even is not what it was in 2010. They are just trying to get rid of us wholesale. We've lost so many great people because those people involved in the humanities have this kind of critical perspective. So that
Perspective.
brings me back to the point about I run a module, for example, called Media Discourse Global Dissent.
Hmm.
And we tell the students at the beginning, if you're looking for a neutral kind of balanced, analysis of the relationship between citizen and governance, let's just put it that way, don't do this module at all because it's about media and protest. And in most cases where protest is taking place for a socially progressive reason, that's what we're going to talk about framing. We're going to talk about how it's framed. We're going to talk about discourse analysis. We're going to talk about evaluative language. And I think Bedronek and another colleague wrote a great book on that. But its sympathies and its interests lie entirely with the people who are trying to make moral interventions in the society. So, but it's interesting how many colleagues are really quite nervous in these fields about appearing biased. So what we do is we just say, yeah, we're going to be scientifically accurate about what we say. We've got an attitude to our own politics, a critique of ourselves, but our starting point is that everything is arse backwards. We're
Hmm.
living in this hierarchical nightmare, which is getting worse. And one option out of it is supposedly produced by Andrew Tate. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
It's
it's
kind of
shocking. Well, actually,
the
that
absurdity.
what you were just saying, Prof, brings me round to what was going to be, in fact, my last question. And I wondered if I could pose that to you at the same time as inviting you, once you've replied, to add anything you want.
Thanks. Yeah.
And that could be retracing steps we've already covered, or it might be new material. But my last question is actually to do with your work on protest, because in addition
Okay.
to
Yeah.
teaching about it in what sounds like a great class that I want to sign up for, you've also published a lot about protest. And this
Yes.
is a time when the politics of spectacle has been seized comprehensively by the right. We've seen one of the biggest marches since the Iraq
Oh,
War
yeah.
in Britain
Yeah.
by a bunch of people who are probably in a complicated coalition where they don't all
Yes.
necessarily
Absolutely
agree.
right.
But the point is, it is an effective right-wing mobilization of the sort of protest that, in inverted commas, we thought was, in inverted commas, our terrain. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I mean, let's the stuff we published was couple of edited books, and we our initial. I'll talk about the where it came from, I think,
Sure.
because what we used to do. There's a colleague of mine called Ruth Sansabido, who's one of my Spanish colleagues, and we were going on the fag end of the Indignados demonstrations in Barcelona, Madrid, and other places around 2013. And what was interesting to us then was looking at precisely what you've just mentioned, which was spectacle. So we used to go to the protests before they'd formed up, take photographs, look at it spatially as a kind of dramatic setting, because our theory, and we reproduced this I think we reproduced it best in a short piece we wrote for a journal, and it was all about what the revolution of the ladders, which was basically the people who were working for Telefonica had occupied the famous Barcelona landmark, which is the Telefonica building, which is there in George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and that was the that not to get too historical now, that was the starting point for the May events of 1937, which we're also very interested in. But anyway, they occupied this, and in we did some interviews about it with the people occupying it. We theorized what was going on, and part of our theorization was uh, what space people had to kind of maneuver in on the left in opposition to these managerial attacks, the usual attacks on working conditions, time, and the rest of it. So it was a big event in Catalonia at the time. So our interest was in, for example, the way in which police forces controlled events, but not in the spectacular sense that you get the kind of the usual story. If you look at the old protest paradigm material, which has been superseded a bit, but is still very useful. The protest paradigm says, yeah, the press will be okay if it's peaceful, but they'll take the last 15 minutes of violence, sometimes started by the police, and categorize the whole event in that way. So it was that we were interested in. So we'd return at the end of a protest when it was all being tidied up and the streets were being cleared. So it was a long day, but it was precisely in terms of the spectacle. And then, of course, we bought all the press, looked online, and I was still doing this throughout the Catalan crisis, the independence crisis. I was there 4 times each year, I think 2017, 18, 19, to see how the protest was presented on the streets because I was on these demos and would take all the material, the photographs, and then how it was mediated. Because of course, if you're on these things, the fascinating thing is the things that don't get reported because they're never seen. And just to conclude on this bit, it's the same with the UK. We went on an anti-fascist demonstration in 2012, February, quite a well-known one in Leicester. And what was interesting was the hidden spatial control, the announcement from the police that the left couldn't stand next to the clock tower because the right were going to. And if we didn't move, once on 1 minute we were doing something legal, as soon as they announced over the megaphones and gave out leaflets, we would have been arrested had we not moved. So it's those things about protest and the way the spectacle is created. And just finally on the far right demonstration, you're absolutely right. Complicated coalition. The trouble is the head of the snake there was fascist. That was the problem. And what was shocking to the left and a lot of people, a lot of centrists who are worried about their version of systemic democracy getting trampled on,
Mm.
was precisely the fact that people who claimed not to be racist went on the demo. And now we've got mainstream politicians in the Conservative Party echoing what reformers said about expelling people who already got leave to remain in the UK. And that is very alarming. So, what was the last question? I
Well,
forgot.
the last question was about protests, but what I wanted to do to finish up was to invite you to add anything you wish. It may
Okay.
be that takes the form of commenting on a topic we've already traversed, or it might be
Mm.
something new because we haven't talked, for example, in any detail about how you do discourse analysis. And that might be
Yes.
something you want to talk about, but it might be something else. Just anything that comes to mind that you want to emphasize as a concluding moment.
Yeah. I think probably um, if we stick for the moment with what I've done most recently,
Hmm.
um,
Great. Hmm.
and there's various stuff, but we've spent months in the union from May to now defending people identified at risk of redundancy. So that's practically all we've been doing. But it occurred to me while I was doing it, as you know, Toby, I wrote a piece on managerial behavior during the pandemic.
Right.
Um, Listening to people on the left, for example, There's a new party called Your Party, which is the Corbyn Sultana leftist. It's a proper mess. A load of people joined, and it's almost reassuringly messy at the moment. But the interesting thing about it was looking at the material produced by people on the left. Who's the target? It's usually the billionaires and the bosses.
Right.
What I've been writing about for a while now is managerialism, and there's a couple of French theorists who think it's a proper economic class, and I've got issues with that. But nonetheless, in terms of a strategic intervention, there is a managerialist class that is getting away scot-free with screwing everything up because basically we know that Elon Musk is not going to appear looking over our shoulder to see what we're doing and whether we've been productive that day. Someone else is doing this on behalf of the tech bros, the billionaires, and these big corporate bosses.
Right.
And what's fascinating to me is the conformist behavior, the high salaries, and the lack of any moral principle that this class is responsible for, and it's not being properly called out as the absolute enemy number one, which in my opinion is in the NHS, in the police service, in universities, in schools, which have become academies, anywhere that used to be the public sector. There's tons of research on this. Krakauer wrote a great book on managerialism as ideology. And if people are interested, I'd recommend to have a look at Krakauer's book, have a look at anything on managerialism. It's been around forever. But now, in the phase we're in, this kind of late neoliberal, techno-feudal, apologies to the serious theorists on that, you know, we need to identify who's actually gaining from this on behalf of the people that we never will encounter because Elon Musk doesn't take the bus with us, does he?
Indeed, he doesn't. And this professional managerial class is something, as you said, it's been written about a lot. Another source that I'd recommend people to think about is the Ehrenreichs, Barbara Ehrenreich and her ex-husband, John, who wrote this book in the late 70s about it in its US incarnation. But Prof. Stewart, I want to thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
with us.
My
You've
pleasure.
contributed a lot pedagogically. As you said, you wrote that pioneering media studies textbook for schools/beginning college
Yeah.
students, university students in the early 90s. Many books since written and edited, special issues of journals, lots of articles, always with a scientific eye to things, but with a humanistic and socialistic impulse.
Yeah,
And I
thank
think
you.
that's what you were driving at, what you were explaining a moment ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
those contributions over more than 30 years, quite apart from the pedagogy you must have been doing in schools before that, is immense. Those contributions are immense. And it's been terrific learning from you today, as I have done in reading your work over so many years.
That's very kind, and I hope to make more contributions to the libertarian left in the future. Thank you very much, Toby.